It was October, and that meant it was time for the second annual Bigfoot Laid Back Georgia Gathering. For this event, people had traveled from Washington, the state, not the city, from Oklahoma, from Florida, and from the upper Midwest, and just down the road to meet here. There were even people here from other parts of the world to spend a few days in like-minded company, learning what they could from people of long experience with the Sasquatch people. In all, there were 22 people gathered. Having flown in from the far Pacific Northwest for this event, I was made most welcome by dear friends, most of whom I knew from previous gatherings of one kind or another, and a few who I had yet to bond with. I was most grateful for the arrangements that had been made for me there, so that I had no need to bring my own tent and camp gear. Though I did purchase a camp chair I prefer, and left it there with our host so that it magically reappeared from year to year as I returned. A tent was provided for me, and when I arrived, I found there was no need for me even to pitch my own tent. It had all been done for me. I had heard all of my life about Southern hospitality, but this was above and beyond for certain. My first night in camp was a wonder. The sun had no more than abandoned the sky, and the webs of darkness held sway when, laying in my bunk and listening to the night, I heard the unmistakable calls of the Sasquatch people communicating, one with another, across the river. I loved their song of the night, and I laid quietly, hoping it would continue. Alas, as I more than expected, soon a dog on one of the neighboring places began barking, most likely due to his timing, in response to the plaintive howls in the night. I feared this would be all I would hear this night, but after a short time, this canine virtuoso decided he'd done his duty in protecting his home grounds and quieted his complaints. There was little wind this evening, and what did materialize was soft like a lover's kiss, gentle and unsure at first, but becoming more urgent and demanding with time, only to recede to the most minimal of distractions. As the night progressed, even this abated, leaving nothing to interfere with the symphony of the night. Again those calls came, distant to be sure, but so clear on the now still night. Now the barred owls joined in, and added a new timbre to the orchestra of the night. There were the ubiquitous frogs adding their rivets in a sublime counter-tempo to the midnight overture. It was far past the bewitching hour as I realized I had been laying and listening to this song of the South for more than 3 hours at this point. I knew the gas cylinder in my lamp had to be running low, and it would soon be time to close my Kindle, turn the light off, and go to sleep. But I was hearing footfalls, bipedal footsteps in the packed dirt outside my tent, and I didn't want to give it up. Thump, 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 they went from the campfire back towards Gale's tent. Then, thump, 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 back they came again towards my tent. For more than 10 minutes they continued from one side of the camp to the other, and back again, finally to come to a halt in the vicinity of my tent. Quietly, I laid my Kindle on my chest, and peered from my position flat on my back, in my cot, over the top of my head and out the window of my tent, only to see a large, hairy face peering back in at me. Instantly, I could see the dawning on his countenance that he had been caught peeking. With a slight, almost imperceptible yelp, he leapt backwards, ducked down, and was gone. For some moments I lay there giggling at what had transpired. He was obviously very distraught at having been found out while performing his night antics in camp. On this occasion, the 22 of us were gathered in western Georgia to celebrate our familyhood, to meet face to face, many for the first time. Those we had only heretofore known as part of one group or another in Facebook, and finally to share our love of and research into the enigma of Sasquatch. We had chosen the spot where we had gathered as a result of sending our brother, Keith Bearden, out on scouting missions with the express purpose of finding the perfect place for us to gather. That he had done so is attested to by the fact that the group has returned there for successive years, always with spectacular success. This sophomore gathering was all it was expected to be, and so much more. Arla Collette had organized some of the activities to include presentations by some of those attending. Expeditions into the thicker timber and bush were planned and executed with success. One exceptional event occurred when Alex Munoz and Peck White, both audio experts, were, with plenty of willing assistants, endeavoring to set out night recorders to see if they could capture the sounds of the Sasquatch in the depth of the night. As they were making their way into the creek bottom they had identified as the area they were to monitor, they were approached by two of the custodians of the area, inquiring as to what the team had planned. Fearing they might have violated some tenet of the area they were in, they began to explain that they were doing research, and as part of that wanted to monitor the night sounds in the area. The custodians both began to stutter and back water, stating that this was a wild area, and there were often noises heard that were not easily explained, and that they may hear things they may not recognize, and etc., and so on and so forth. Our pair knew what they were speaking of, and even what they were trying not to speak of, and with a laugh, stopped them and explained who our group was and why we were here, which calmed the pair down considerably. With great good wishes, they sent the team on their way with hopes for the best of good fortune. One of the oddities found all around our camp, which spoke to us loudly, were the presence of non-human built, unnatural structures. The most commonly encountered were the X structures. To those who have studied the phenomenon, have learned to convey the message of friendship and welcome. The other most commonly found were the bent arch. In this structure, entire trees of varying diameters and heights were bent to the ground and the top anchored there. Evenings, after dinner, were almost universally spent around the communal campfire. After dark had settled in, usually more than 15 people could be found around the fire, sharing stories and time together. The fire was large, as our resident firemaker, Jonathan, was a master at that task. He took the task to heart and did his best to make the most of the chore. On the evening about to describe, attendance was indeed generous, and all who could be there seemingly were there. Conversation was lively and discussion animated as the day's events were revisited and tomorrow's events anticipated. The adjacent photograph, taken by Jennifer Cotney, was just before the majority of the crowd arrived, although if one looks closely just behind me and just behind Gail seated to my right, one can see the shine from the eyes of two of our guests. Annette, grandmother of the young girl playing in the fire, moved up beside Jennifer, who had the camera in taking the photograph, and the two women, neither of whom had ever had a face-to-face encounter with the Sasquatch, began to chat from that position. Within a very few minutes the crowd had gathered around the fire. To my right, and to the right of Gail, to the south side of the fire, were Arla and the Hensons. Keith was next to Farrell Henson. People continued to come in until the entire ring was filled. From my position on the west side of the fireplace, I was looking directly across to the east and Jennifer and Annette, when suddenly Annette looked stricken. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish as she was gulping water, and her eyes opened widely. At once her lips began to quiver like she was about to cry, and she grabbed piteously at Jennifer's arm with one hand, while the other tried to rise and point west behind me. From the direction of her eyes, in a weak, almost non-existent voice, she uttered, "Look there." Instantly, without thought or plan, I dropped my head directly back so as to look behind me. What I saw shocked me as it had her. There, at the very edge of the firelight, but still readily visible, were two Sasquatch people. To the right of me, precisely where the shine is in the photograph, was an apparent juvenile, so said because he was smaller than the much larger individual who was virtually directly behind me and nearly close enough to touch, had it chosen to do so. Without a moment's hesitation, they both darted back into the woods and out of our immediate sight. Immediately, Arla, Keith, and Zach Henson followed them back into the brush and in a short distance caught up with and watched them in the brush for a bit. One adult and two juvenile-sized individuals, most likely an adolescent male who would be expected to be tending the children and two of his charges. After watching for a few minutes, the contact was broken and the trio returned to the now overexcited crowd around the fire. It was 8-year-old Zach who said, "I've seen more Bigfoot on one campout than Finding Bigfoot has seen in 3 years." And you know, he's right.